So my name is Jigar Shah. I work as an enterprise solutions architect. I'm a global community speaker for multiple Salesforce events. And sorry about that. And I'm 4x Salesforce certified. Not sure why this. Okay, I'll just try to get this off of my window. All right. So what are we going to talk about today? We're going to talk about, why do we need control flow statements within Apex, right? And what are those control flow statements and what are the different types? We're going to talk a little bit about expressions and operators and how do you use them in combination with the control flow statements. Last but not the least, we're going to learn. So this is actually a question that came over from our previous session, which was a phenomenal session delivered by Jitendra Jha. So that it's about understanding how do we use list versus a set versus a hash map. Last but not the least, we're going to talk about what relevant Trailhead modules you could do to get your hands dirty and become more proficient at the concepts that we talk and showcase today. And of course, we have some time for question and answers. Before we get started, some housekeeping rules so as to make this interaction efficient, productive, and useful for everybody joining us today. Please do mute your mic. Make sure that you keep adding in questions in the Zoom question and answer window. We have our team, Maria, Amit, Abhi, and Jitendra, who will be looking at the questions. I myself will be looking at the questions and will try to answer them at the end of the session. And don't feel shy. No questions are silly. So just feel free to put down your questions and ask as many questions as you can to make the most of this session. All right. With that, so why do we need control flow statements in Apex? Okay. Usually, so control flow statements are very specific type of statements, and what they are and how they are actually written as a part of your Apex program, we'll definitely dwell further. But before we understand the solution, we need to understand the problem or the challenge. So often when you write or when you program in any particular programming language, these are some of the common needs which have been listed down on the slide over here. So you would often want to do conditional executions where you want to check conditions like, or you want to compare data. So you want to check conditions like if this then that, or you want to make comparisons in data. You're trying to do mathematical operations, you're trying to find out a larger number, all sorts of computations that you want to do. Or you want to also traverse over a list of data elements, and these data elements could be of different types. In our last session, we spoke about what are the different data types that are available, right? And beyond that, you also want your program or your piece of code that you're writing, you want them to execute in a very repeated fashion. So that's where some of these control flow statements come in very handy and help us realize this need for either making decisions or making comparisons or doing the computations, right? So now that we have a slightly better understanding of the problem as to why we need control statements, let's jump into understanding what exactly are control flow statements. So control flow statements basically govern the behavior of your Apex code, right? They will define how a particular Apex program needs to behave, right? And there are different types of control flow statements. We would be going through them in a while. So the control flow statements can be categorized into two basic type of categories. So there are conditional control flow statements, and then there are iterative control flow statements. So conditional statements. So just like we make decisions in our real lives, where we have to make decisions in terms of choices, whether it is the car we drive, the shoes we wear, the clothes we wear. Similar way, when we write programs, whether in Apex or any programming language, we intend to make decisions. And that is where the conditional statements come in handy and really prove helpful. So let's understand what are the types of conditional statements which are available within Apex, and what is the magic that we can do with these conditional statements. Right? So within Apex, we have three basic types of conditional statements. Okay. And if you really look at it, a lot of it is analogous or very similar to talking in any kind of language, right? I mean, just a spoken language that I'm really referring to here versus a programming language. So, you often have reference to if else's. So if I had a lot of money, I would be doing something else. I would have done something differently. Or, you often tend to switch between multiple comparisons or, multiple evaluations. That's what a switch statement is. And last but not the least, the ternary operator. Well, it is a very special operator. We're going to talk about it and see how ternary operators are used. But like this beautiful girl over here who's trying to make a decision, saying that if I get at least 10 rupees, I'm going to buy a chocolate, or else I'm going to buy a candy. So that's exactly how conditional statements help you drive decisions within your program, and which in turn help you realize the business logic for which you will be implementing your Apex program. Right. So let's just dwell further and look at what an if-else statement looks like. Okay. Now, an if-else statement has, the screen right now, it shows two basic variants, but the most fundamental type of an if-else statement evaluates a particular Boolean condition, and it also has an else block, right? And the other combination or the other variation of an if-else statement is an if, else if, and else, where you could not only check one particular condition, one particular Boolean condition, but you could also add a default block, which is the one that is highlighted over here. And believe me, that's an optional block. So if you're doing comparisons on multiple conditions, and you want a default condition to be included, then an else block would be handy, but that's not mandatory. Okay. So with this, what I'm going to do is I'm going to keep switching back and forth and change my screens, because we have a demo planned for each and every statement that we look at, and see how we can really use them practically to get our hands dirty on Apex. Okay. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to switch to my developer org, and I've opened up the developer console. For people who are not really conversant as to what this is, and really are joining us today, a developer org is basically an org that you can get free of cost by just signing up. If you're not sure where to do that and how to do that, just refer to the session 1 recording, which is available on the Path to Code website. And within that, you can go to this. Once you're logged in, you sign up and you log in, you can go to this particular gear icon and click the developer console, which will actually bring you to a similar window. I already have some pieces of code written, and I already have some of these program snippets ready in the interest of time. Right. So what I'm going to do is look at our first variant of an if-else. Now, the beauty of programming in any language, and especially in Apex, is that I can simulate the real world, and it is not very different from the real world. So this particular statement of this girl.
Sorry to interrupt you. We are able to see only your presentation. If you are sharing your screen, we are not able to see that.
Okay, thanks for that, Amit. Let me just quickly check. All right. Can you guys see it now?
Yeah.
Yep.
All right, perfect. So so this is the developer console, which the developer sales org, where I'll be writing all the programs. And like I said, for people who've joined us today and not really conversant with what this is a free Salesforce developer org, which I can just sign up, and it is a lifetime free org. You can just do that by going to developer.salesforce.com, and once you are logged into your Salesforce org, you have a console which is basically an editor where you can write all your code, right? So you don't really need to install any kind of IDE on your machine. Uh, and even without that, you could efficiently write your code with all those fancy features that as a developer, um, uh, you may need, like IntelliSense and syntax highlighting, and there's much more to this particular tool. But just to understand the concept of an if-else statement, I was trying to say is you can actually realize or you can emulate what you do in real life within a program, and that's what I'm going to do with this particular um, code snippet which I have over here ready, and it exactly emulates what this girl in the presentation is talking about. All right. So I'm going to go back to my developer console, and I'm going to open the execute anonymous window. Um, what exactly is an execute anonymous window? Um, when you are doing, or when you're writing out programs or you're testing out things, there are often smaller code snippets that you would want to run in an ad hoc fashion, right? And that's exactly where the execute anonymous window comes in handy. You can just uh, copy and or you can type in your code snippet based on you know uh, whether based on your conditions and your business logic, and you can just execute it directly from the developer console, right? And so here what I'm going to do is I've emulated the same condition. So this is exactly how you write an if-else statement, right? So the if-else statement, the first piece is the condition, the Boolean condition, if you see, and each condition has a piece of code block that is associated with that condition. Now in this case, just to keep it simple, what I'm doing is I'm writing system.debug statements. Again, for people who are not very conversant with what a system.debug statement is, a system.debug statement is nothing but a statement that is output or written to your logs. Okay, so how am I going to see the logs? Um, Within developer console, once you maximize this window, there is a section where all your logs are shown. So whenever you execute a program or anything via the open execute anonymous window, that's exactly when a log will be generated, and you will be able to see the specifics of what executed as a part of your program based on the code that you're executing. So let me just go back to the original code piece. So this is an if-else statement which says that I have what I've declared as a variable of type decimal. So that basically defines the amount of money that I have, right? And what I'm going to do is I'm going to have my Apex code make a decision saying that, which says that if the money that I have is more than 10, then I'm going to buy a candy, or else I'm going to buy a chocolate. Now in this case, I'm going to just simulate this by changing the input over here manually. And I'm going to say the money that I have, let's say, is 8 rupees. And I'm going to just say execute. Now, once I do that, the log opens up. So this is the debug log. And within the debug log, if you see the output that has been printed, it says that I will buy a chocolate, which means that the program made a decision based on the if else condition that we had stated and the input provided, and it gave you an output. So this is one variation of how you can use an if else to make a decision. If I had to just go back and change the same thing, it would execute the other branch. Let's say I make this as 18. Now, what should happen? What should be the output? The output here should be, of course, that I should be able to, or I will buy a candy. So I'm going to execute it one more time. And now if you see, I'm going to filter the debug statements, right? So this checkbox right here directly helps you filter the debug statements within the execution log. So now if you see, the output now shows that I will buy a candy. So the program is making decisions at runtime based on the input that is provided. So this is the very first way in which I can really write decisions. And this is a very simple example of how we can do that with an Apex. Now, switching back over to my slide deck. So we saw this one particular variation where we were doing an if-else statement, but often it is not just, life is not simple, right? There can't be just two choices. There are multiple choices, and we are often confused as to what we do. So just like just to emulate that situation, you also have an if else if statement, and which is highlighted over here. So let me just show you how I can really leverage an if else if statement within Apex and enable decision making when the number of choices I have are too many. So I have a small code snippet here, which I am again going to copy, and I'm going to paste it within my developer console. All right. So this particular piece of code, what it's trying to do is it is trying to print the number, equivalent number, based on the textual input of that particular number, right? So we have a number which is in words, and we're just trying to print it as a numerical, right? But if you see, we're going here, we have multiple choices where we are trying to say that we are either trying to print 1, 2, or 3. But there is also this specific optional statement which I have added over here. And the reason why I say that this is particularly optional, we'll see about it as to why it behaves that way. But let's just go and execute this program to get a better understanding. So for now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to send the input as 2, right? As which is this input string, and that is the input string based on which we are making a decision, right? So ideally, if this program executes as we desire, we would have the second branch of if else if execute and output the number 2 to the debug log. So let's see if it works that way. Okay, magic, yes. So it did work, and it was able to identify the input that was given to that particular program, and it did output the number for that equivalent word, that is 2 in this case, based on the input that we had given. Now, going back to the optional statement, the optional else statement that I was talking about. Now, the optional else statement starts executing. Okay, so what I'm going to do is just to see the behavior of the else statement, I'm going to change the input that I'm giving to 5. Now what is going to happen is, because my program doesn't really understand what 5 is, it is not going to be able to execute any of these choices. And see, let's see what exactly it does, right? So I'm going to just say execute one more time. and this time once it executes, you see that there is a default condition which it executed, which means which says that the number is 0, and that's because that's the condition that we put in the optional else block, right? But just to get a better understanding of how this is all tying in together, is because the program is not able to understand a word or the input that we have given, and we have provided a default condition, it it executes the default condition always in case a match is not found. Now, like I said, because this was optional, we could also write a statement by completely eliminating this. Now, in this case, the program would do nothing, and ideally it shouldn't be printing anything out to the debug log because none of the conditions are satisfied. One other thing to note is all of these conditional statements all of these control flow statements are procedural in nature, which means they execute from top to bottom in the order in which they are written. So it will start from line number. So when the program execution begins, it starts from line number 2 and moves over from 4 to line number 11 based on the logic or the conditions being realized. So let me just execute this one more time and see if it has what is the behavior of the program in this particular case. So the program has executed, but if you see, there are no debug statements that are being executed, and this is purely because there was no default condition, the else block, which has been provided. All right, now with that, uh, let's move over to understand what are the other types of control flow statements. So these are just some of the variations that we talked about. Let me switch back to my slide deck. But before we jump over to understanding what the other type of control flow statements are, let's understand what are operators, or it is very important to understand what operators and expressions are and how they really um, help execute your control flow statements. So operators and expressions are one of the keys, or the most the most fundamental constructs of any kind of programming language. So if you're conversant with any other programming language like Java or um, .NET, C Sharp, um, they all of the programming languages would have operators, and just operators and expressions to be precise. So expressions are nothing but statements which are a combination of uh, uh, you know op, having operations. So it's there are basically different types of expressions that we could have. We could have a literal expression. We could have an expression where a new object is being created. We could have an assignment expression where a particular variable or a value is being particular value is being assigned to a variable. So those are what expressions are. So some of the programs that I wrote now, for example, uh, let me just switch back to the developer console and show you what I meant. Okay. Um, So yeah, just to keep it simple, don't really worry about the other pieces over here, but this right over here is an expression where there is some computation being done, and there is a value being assigned. So this is more like an assignment expression. Same way you could have something which is a regular literal expression, which is more like this. All right. So these are what are called expressions, but expressions are usually bound together by something called as operators, and that's what we are going to see over here in this particular slide. So operators, so there are different operators are some, help the expressions here, and there are different reasons why a certain operator may be used, right? So like you see, when you make decisions or you make computation. So let's start with some of the simplest of the operators which you might have already known. The mathematical operators. So there is so you use an asterisk or a forward slash as the division operator, the multiplication and the division operator. You have other addition and subtraction operators. Then there are comparison operators which basically help you say that if something the left hand side of the expression and the right hand side of the expression are equal or not, or you try to understand if they are greater or lesser. And then of course there are logical operators which help you make decisions, whether, because like I said, life is not simple and you end up making complicated choices. And when you write programs, it is very similar. So you would have multiple conditions which are tied together by a logical and multiple conditions which are tied together by a logical or. So basically if you say, if I had just to put it in simple English from a logical operator standpoint, I would say if I had a lot of money and a Ferrari, I would be really happy, right? So now this is a great example of using a logical and operator. Now, you must be wondering, we were talking about control flow statements and why suddenly we had to jump into, expressions and operators. Doesn't really go well. Well, don't worry, I'll just explain that to you in a minute. That's because I wanted to explain or wanted to help you understand ternary operators. So what exactly is a ternary operator? Ternary operator is a very special type of operator. Okay. And whenever you talk about operators, any kind of operators, this is a condition that you would, sorry about that. This is a condition that you would keep, or this is a term that you would keep seeing or hearing, is whether it is left associative or right associative. Now, what does this term really mean? A left associative term means that the operator, or the expression involving the operator will be evaluated from left to right. Okay, so from, if I'm writing a particular expression, this is example of an expression, it would be evaluated from left towards the right. Versus if any of the documentation mentions any operator as a right associative operator, it means that it is evaluated, the expression involving that operator is evaluated from right to left, right? But most of these or all of these operators follow a rule or an order in which they are evaluated, because there is a set precedence from Apex based on which it evaluates. Because often when you write conditions in your real world programs, um, you would end up using multiple operators. Like you would have a multiple, you would have a mathematical operator, you would have a comparison operator and a logical operator. So based on the precedence that is showcased over here in this particular slide, the operators would be, the expressions would be evaluated and processed. Now, going back to the ternary operator. So ternary operator is a very handy operator and is a great notation for writing if then else statements. So a couple of minutes ago, we learned how to really write an if then else statement, right? Ternary operators really come in handy when you're writing real world programs, and especially when you end up writing real world programs in Apex, they run into thousands of lines. And that is when the ternary operator is a shorthand and helps reduce the number of lines of code purely based on the syntax, and it exactly operates in the fashion that I've showcased, or the syntax that that is showcased over here. It comprises of a Boolean condition, a question mark, followed by the value. If the Boolean condition holds, executes and is evaluated to true, this is the value that that is received. Else, if the condition does not hold true, and if it is false, this is the value after after colon is what it receives. Okay, so let's just go back to our developer console, switch back to our developer console, and understand how this can be done. Right now, So here, let me just quickly. So because we said that uh, the ternary operator is a variant of the regular if else, we're just going to go back or circle back to our original examples of buying a candy versus a chocolate. Now, if you recall, originally what we had written was something like this, right? Let me just quickly type it in. We had this, and then we had a statement and a condition. So this was the original method or way in which we had expressed our decision making for buying a candy versus a chocolate. Now the same thing I can really put it into in a very concise way using my ternary operator. So if you really see, the conditions are still the same. It's just the method or the way in which I have written, right? So what I can really do, and it will still give me the same output. Uh, all that it is doing right now is it is just making things very simple for me. Instead of 4 statements, I have compiled everything into a single statement, and it's making my program really shorter and very effective to read. So what I'm going to do is go back and I'm going to run this particular piece of code and see if it really works the same way as a regular if else condition would. Right. So in this case, because I have 120 rupees, that's which is more than my candy purchase budget, I am going to be able to buy a candy, right? So that's what it should be doing. All right, let's see. So if you see here, it's output saying that I will buy a candy, right? And it would exactly operate the same way that I would do with a regular if else. So this is one way of really writing or making your program more readable and offering a shorthand to writing the regular if else conditions. Okay. And you could also tie this in with multiple Boolean conditions. In this case, I have a single condition, but I could say that if the money that I had was between, let's say, 2 and uh, 5, I'm just changing the business logic over here, then I'd buy okay, then I'd buy a candy, or else I'd buy a chocolate. So you could do that as well. So if you have multiple Boolean conditions, you could use that to influence your decision making in the program and your overall program's control flow, right? Now, this is still something that can be optimized, and if you really had to make it extremely concise, right? If I had to really write it, I would be writing it in this particular way, where now, if you see, here I am having really 3 statements, but here with the help of a ternary operator, I have just condensed it into just 2 statements, and it will still give me the same output based on what we were trying to achieve. So the output in this case should be that yes, I'll buy a candy. So what I'm going to do and is execute the program. Okay, it's, yeah, the message. So that's a variable which I had used but had not declared, and that's the reason why Apex said that it did not understand what variable I was really referring to. So I'm just going to comment out this code and just try again one more time. And if you see now, the output should still be the same. So irrespective of the way in which you write your conditions, whether using a regular if else, or whether you're using a multiple if else if or a ternary condition, you could still achieve or get the same output. Okay, it entirely depends on the type of control control flow that you really want to embed within your program. Okay. Um, Now, let me just switch over and showcase a very important statement, important control flow statement, which is a part of the decision making, is the switch statement. Now, the switch statement is something that is the new kid on the block. It just came in, I think, a release or two ago. Earlier in Apex, we never had switch statements, but with switch statements, life became a lot easier, especially when you have several values available from which you need to make a choice or, you know, perform a match, right? Uh, so this is how you would really end up writing a switch expression or a switch statement. So the switch statement comprises of three main pieces. The first is the expression or the logical expression based on which I would switch, right? And then there are limitations. I would not say limitations, but there are operating boundaries based on which what I can include as an expression for a switch statement. uh, then the matching value as to what matches. So when that particular expression is evaluated, uh, the output of that expression matches to what particular value, and based on that particular block is executed. And the third is, of course, the execution code block. Okay. Now there's a very special piece to this, which I'm going to be talking about in a few seconds from now. But like I said, there are operating boundaries in terms of the expression, the type of expression that I could use. So if you just take a step back, there were some of the data types that we talked about in our first session. And there are some primitive data types that we could use as a part of the expression, as well as some complex data types, right? So the primitive data types are the string, integer, long. So you could write your expressions based on these data types, or you could also use an S object or an enum to write an expression and do a value match and have the respective code block executed accordingly. Okay, so let's just go back to our developer console and understand how to write a switch statement. But before that, one very important thing to understand is um, the data types in Apex that we talked about are all nullable, which means all of them, whether it is an integer or a string or maybe an S object, you could assign them to null values, and that's where you could use that as a default condition to make sure that the when you're having multiple choices and you're really not sure of what could be an outcome. Null is something that uh, uh, operates in a one size fits all kind of a model, and that's where it could come in really handy. And I'll showcase to you what I really mean by assigning nulls or using them as a part of your switch statements. So let's just go back and go to the developer console. Okay, so now in this particular case, what I'm going to do is, okay, I'm going to exit out of my presentation mode and now go back to the developer console. Let me just switch off some of the existing windows over here. So I have a sample piece of Apex code over here. Now this is what is an Apex class, and this particular class has an enum of which is a medal. So like we know, medals are going to be three. It could either be a gold, silver, or a bronze. And because I want
Jigar, we're seeing the notepad on the screen.
All right. All right. I believe you should be able to see the developer console now.
Yep.
All right, perfect. So, so just like, you know, a medal in real world would have three options. It could either be a gold, silver, or a bronze. That's the reason why I'm using an enum, where because I know that my choices are very, very fixed and limited. And even if somebody's going to be using that particular entity, my choices are going to be limited from the ones that I provide, so that I can regulate those choices, right? That's exactly why an enum is generally used in a real world. And then it has a method called as know your medal, which basically outputs your position based on what your medal type is. So if you have gold, you stood first, right? Uh, Now, what we're really going to do is this particular method is making its decision and writing its output based on a switch statement, right? And like I said, based on you could have an expression which could either be an integer, a long, an enum, an s object, right, or a string. In this case, we are using an enum, which is implemented here to make our decision. So let's just see the program in action. How are you going to run this program? Now, running these programs is slightly different from the regular uh, execute anonymous code snippets that we were running all this while, right? Because this is a class and it cannot run on its own, there has to be some kind of triggering that we need to do, or invoking the class, so that the code within that particular class is going to run. So what I'm going to do is invoke the class using this particular small code snippet that I have. And let me just explain to you what I'm really trying to do. So within my anonymous code block, I am trying to instantiate a particular class, which is episode 2 in this particular case. I've created a new instance, right? Uh, and circling back to the concept, just as a refresher, we have the new keyword, which means that, you know, if you're really passing an instance of a particular class from one method to another, or one point of execution to another, it is passed by reference and not by value, as opposed to your regular primitive data types, which are you know, just to name string, integer, long, some of those, right? Then with the help of that instance, what I'm trying to do is I'm going to call the know your medal method, which is implemented right over here, and I'm passing my option as an input as to what is the option, what is the medal color that I want. Based on that, I will get an output. The method will run and it will output your uh, you know, rank to the debug log. Okay, let's just hold on and let this take a backseat for a while, and I'll explain how we can use that. So what I'm going to do is run this particular piece of code and let's see what happens. So because I passed my input as gold, the program ran, the class ran, the method ran, and it made a decision of outputting this particular string to the debug log, which is what you see over here. Wow, you stood first. Now, so depending on whatever option I pass to this particular method, okay, let me just change it to maybe bronze, and that will really change the decision and the block which is actually executing. So it is actually making decisions and outputting the value. So now in this case, the output here should be third. Yes. So that's exactly how decisions are being made with the switch statement. But circling back to a concept that we were talking a few minutes ago is the nullable types, which means that everything in Apex can be assigned as a null. And that's what we will see now using this particular switch code snippet. Now, if you really notice over here, I've added a default condition, right? So the expression, so the value based on an expression could also be a null, right? Which is where I'm saying that when nothing, I've not really put a value else. So that is the real way of writing a default condition in a switch, right? So if it really doesn't understand the color of the metal that I'm providing, it is going to give me this particular default condition. Okay. And again, all these statements are procedural, which means that they will execute top to bottom, right? So it'll start with evaluating gold, silver, bronze, and then if it doesn't find anything, then it's going to evaluate the default condition. So let's just see how this works in the real case. Okay. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to there are two ways in which we could execute this. One is I put an invalid option, but in that case, the program is not going to compile, and it's going to say that because the enum doesn't really understand what the value is, it's not going to be able to proceed further. So let's say if I say blue, right? If I just try to execute this, it's not going to execute. Yeah, because that's exactly why an enum is used. It allows you to regulate what are the options that you provide to the user. So you can think of it as a pick list, right, where you are limiting the options. So what I'm going to do is now comment this out and uncomment this particular code snippet where I don't know the color and I'm explicitly passing a null. Now in this particular case, because we are passing the null as an input, the enum is going to be evaluated against a null operator. And because we have this particular default condition block, it is going to print this last particular default condition, which says, sorry, you have selected an invalid metal color. So let's just go ahead and execute this particular statement. Okay. And now if you see, it says that, sorry, you have selected an invalid metal color, right? So this is exactly how you could use nulls to, to assign and compare with regular enums. But even beyond that, there is one interesting way which you could use the switch expression as. So the expression in this case was an enum, right? But you could also have a switch expression as a method. So you could directly have a method which computes certain output, and you are comparing the values of that method, values with the output of that method, right? Guys, just give me a second. Sorry about that. So, so we're going to look at how you could use methods as expressions in a switch statement to do your comparisons. Okay. So going back, I'm going to go back or circle back to my anonymous window. But before that, I'll just explain. I have a small piece of code written over here. This is another Apex class that I have written, which is called as a math service, right? And what that math service does is it actually gets the mod, or it provides, or just to be very, very simple, it just computes the remainder when two numbers are divided, when a number is divided with another number, and it returns the remainder. So that's what this particular method does, right? If you come from a programming background in some other language, like a C or a C++, you may have heard of the mod operator. Unfortunately, we don't have a mod operator in Apex. So that's the reason why we have this math library, which is provided as a part of the force.com platform. And it has a ready to use method math.mod that I'm trying to use. So what I'm really doing is I'm passing a number as a parameter, which is an integer type, and I'm trying to evaluate or divide that number and identify divide that number by 2 and identify the remainder and return that particular remainder. So now let's see, because we cannot directly execute a particular class, what I'm going to do is I'm going to invoke it from my anonymous block. But before I do that, let me just quickly copy the code and paste it over here. So this is the code what we have written. So if you see now, this particular piece of code uses a switch statement to invoke and determine the output, to invoke the get mod value method, which is a part of the match service class. So I'm creating an instance of the match service class using my new keyword, and then I'm using the instance to invoke the method, which is the get mod value. And what I'm going to pass over here is 12, right? Now, because 12 is a primitive type and it is an integer, it's going to be passed by a value and not by a reference. Now, and I'm using this particular method as an expression directly within my switch statement as opposed to a regular string or an integer variable, right? So I'm going to quickly execute this, and if you see, because the input was 12, which was an even number, it has told me that you have chosen an even number, right? So this is how you can actually use switch statements and methods as expressions in a switch statement, or an enum as an expression in a switch statement. Now, quickly moving over to a different type of construct, which is the loops. So let's just quickly talk about what are loops. So often when you write programs, there is a need to iterate or traverse collections and uh, operate at scale over multiple values, right? That's when a loop really comes in handy. So with Apex, we have 5 basic types of loops, right? So there is a do while loop, there is a while loop, and there is a for loop. And I'll quickly show you how to write them out. But think of a loop as a roller coaster that is going on its path. So when such a thing happens, when the roller coaster is executing, there are 3 basic things that it needs to really go around its path, right? One is it should know when to start, right? Which is your initialization in this case. Second, it should know when to stop, which is your exit condition in this case. And last but not the least, it should know how to keep proceeding further, which is the increment condition. And if you see any of the loops, all these 3 conditions will hold true, right? Now, all of the loops again are procedural statements, which means they execute top down, right? They start from the top, and as they proceed based on the condition and the logic, they will execute accordingly. Now, what I'm going to quickly do is switch back to my developer console and show you a small example of a do while loop. Okay. Now, you would generally end up using a do while loop or a while loop as compared to a for loop when you want finer control over the increment part of the loop. Okay, so now if all of you can see, I have a small do while loop which is doing nothing, but it has a counter and it is executing based on the counter and going by the condition that we have, the syntax, right? We have a code block, which is basically what I have in my developer console, and the while along with a Boolean exit condition. So now switching back to my developer console, if you see, so I have do and the code block, and I have while and the condition, right? And I have declared a counter which helps me increment and execute the loop, right? If I don't really provide an increment condition, the loop really doesn't understand how it needs to proceed further. So it is not that it will execute once and it will stop. It will actually result into an error, right? But in the interest of time, I'm going to make it really quick, and I'm going to show you how a do while loop can really be executed, right? So go ahead and output this to my developer console log. And if you see, the loop has executed and it has printed out five values, starting at 0 and ending at 4. So because your starting point was 0, you said and you stated in your code that your exit condition is less than 5. This is when it will execute, or this is when the loop will actually execute and come to a halt. The moment it came out, the value became you know greater than 4, or basically when it stopped becoming less than 5, that's when the loop executed, and just it just kind of came to a halt. So it is very important that you clearly state your initialization condition, how do you want to increment and how do you want to stop. Now, if I can just change this in such a way where I can say do while counter equal to well counter plus 2. So now I'm saying that increment by 2. So I'm writing my incremental logic in my loop is custom. I have a finer control, right? The only thing over here in do while is the code is executed first and the condition is checked, right? There will often be situations where you will have to check the condition first and then execute the code. In that case, you would want to opt for a while loop, right? So I'll just quickly run this particular change. And if you see now, you will have much lesser iterations than, which is 3 rather than the earlier 5. So if you want custom control over your the manner in which you want to execute your loop, the do while loop, just alter the incremental condition. On similar lines, when you want to have the condition checked first and then execute the logic, then in that case you might want to use a while loop. Okay, guys, and it is purely based on what kind of a requirement that you're implementing is when you end up using a while versus a do while versus a for. Okay, so let me just show you a quick variation of a while. Okay, I guess there is a problem with the statement. And it is this. Okay, there was an extra semicolon within my code. This is also executing, and it executed based on the condition that I have stated. Okay, so do while and while, based on when you want to check the condition, you can opt for that particular loop to be used in your program. Now, switching back to my presentation, the for loop is one very powerful loop, and it has got 3 variations. In fact, most of the times, I would say 80% of the times when you end up writing programs, for loop is the most common loop that you would end up writing. So let's look at how would I end up how would I write a traditional for loop. So a for loop has 3 basic variations. The traditional for loop, where you can have a finer control and you can access elements based on the index, right? When I say index is nothing but the position. Then the second is when you actually have a variation to the traditional for loop. And if for people who've written C#, it is an equivalent of a for each loop in C#, right? And last but not the least, you can also use a socle for loop, which is you can directly use a socle query within your for loop. The only thing over here to note is so don't worry about a socle, how or the specifics of a socle, because we have an entire session planned on understanding the basics and how to use socle within your Apex code. So I'm not going to be dwelling into the specifics of socle, but I'm going to show you how these 3 variations of a for loop execute and run. So I'm going to use a traditional for loop at first. So I'm going to, so the traditional for loop in this particular piece of code, I have, just making sure my developer console is shared. Okay. Within my developer console, I have this particular piece of code which has a list of colors, and I'm going to iterate over that list of colors and output which color is at what position. Okay. Now, in this case, if you see, this is the notation for accessing elements stored within your list using the index-based notation, right? So the index again is nothing but the position. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to execute this. And once I do that, the output that I see is this particular color is at position. So because red is at position 0, based on what we wrote over here. So this is position 0. So 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. That's how it is. So you would see the output also in that particular fashion. Now, the same thing could be written using a variation, which is a for each sort of a loop. Right, I'm going to quickly where I'm still using the same type of for loop, but it is a variation where I'm saying this here is a collection or a list, right, and or an array, and this specifies the type of each individual element that is stored within this particular array. Now, because there's a list of strings, I'm saying a string color name. Had this been a list of integers, it would have been integer whatever variable name and that particular array name. So I'm going to go out and execute this very quickly. And if you see now, I get the same output using the for each loop, right? Now, last but not the least, the socle for loop, right? In fact, I would say a socle for loop is the variation of the for each loop that we just saw, and I'd explain to you why I say so. So if you really look at a socle for loop, it comprises of two main things: the data type, which is very similar to what we have over here, and then instead of an array or a list, it is actually a socle statement. Now this is another variation where I am doing the assignment and the socle statement within the loop itself, but you could also, that's just because I wanted to have access to the account list variable, right? But I could very well write it in this fashion and it would execute. Only that because I wanted to use account list in my piece of code, that's the reason why I had written this kind of a notation. Only thing to remember is, and why I would say it is a variation, because the socle for loop returns a list, which is, or an array of whatever S object type you are querying on, right? And because this is also a list or an array, it's technically, instead of directly putting a list or an array, you're just replacing it with an equivalent socle, which is a list or an array of an S object type. Okay, so I'm going to go out and execute this one more time and see if it's giving me the right output. So in this case, what it has done is there are account records. So account is a standard object, and that is exactly what we have been trying to print over here. So we have iterated over that list of accounts and use it as a tool to iterate a list and print it out to the debug log, okay, based on their positions. And so that is how you would end up using the different kind of loops within your Apex programs. And last but not the least, choosing over a list versus a set versus a map. So we got this question from our previous session as to, which collection should I be using and when, right? So before we understand how you can use it, it's, quick thing to understand is what is each collection's capability. So a list is an ordered collection of elements, right? Where I have multiple elements of type maybe S object, of primitive data types, And when I say ordered, what does ordered mean? The order is respected based on which the elements are input to that particular collection. So if I input something in a list which is 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and if I print out that list, it is going to print it as 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, right? Versus if I go to a set is an unordered collection, which means it doesn't preserve the order in which the elements are input to that particular collection. So if I input if I have a set of integers and input 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 to a set, and I print out a set, it is going to print it as 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 because it is automatically going to sort. Another important trait of having a set is a set does not allow duplicate values, which means you can't have two 5s, right? Or repeated elements in a set based on the type to which it belongs to. So if you want to store really unique elements as a part of your programming logic, then set is the way to go. If you just want to preserve the order of the elements in which you're going to store and also maybe allow duplicate values, then list is the way to go. Okay, so let's say if you're implementing something like a queue, list is the collection to be used. And last but not the least, map is a really powerful data structure, and some of us also refer to it as hash maps. So a map is basically a list of key value pairs, right? It's a little confusing to understand, but it's a list of key value pairs where key is what helps you get the corresponding element that is stored or corresponding value for that key. Okay, so maps are usually used for efficient searching. So usually when you have to search from a list or a set, you don't have anything unless you know the position of the element to get the value of that element. With a map, it's different. As long as you know the key, you should be able to get the value without really having to iterate and say that, okay, let me iterate to the first, second, third, fourth. And because my element that I'm trying to access is at the 5th position, I'm going to get my search result after 5 iterations, which is true with lists and sets. With maps, all I have to do is provide the key and it will give me back the value. So this is one thing which would help you decide how to choose a list versus a set versus a map within my Apex program, right? Of course, these are collections and required to, when you're operating at multiple on multiple values, that's when you use collections. If you're really operating on single values, then you use variables based on the type of the variable you intend to have. With that, let me just give you a quick leave you with some food for thought in terms of resources and some great Trailhead modules. So we have control flow statements, expressions and operators, switch statements and loops that we talked about. And there are some great in-depth articles around how these can be used and what they are within the Apex developer guide. So I would request you to refer to these resources and dwell further in this topic. Of course, no learning on the Salesforce platform is complete without the amazing Trailhead. So we've got platform development basics and some of the developer console basics, which helps you understand how to use the developer console more efficiently. These are some Trailhead modules which you can do to get your hands dirty and be more proficient at Apex and some of the conditional statements that we've talked about today. With that, Maria, do we have enough time for a question and answer round, or I think we've exceeded our time?
We've exceeded a little bit, but if everyone wants to hang out for maybe another 5 minutes, I don't see any questions in the window yet. So if anybody has any, just feel free to post.
Okay. Even if you're not able to answer your questions right now, we might be able. We have the recording is going to be live on the YouTube channel, and we're going to be having our presentation posted on the website. So you can also add your comments and questions there, and we'll try to answer there as well. But in the meanwhile, if we have questions? Let me just quickly go and check if we have some.
Yep, we have one question from Sai. Can you please explain again the concept of instantiation of a class in the example of metal color and metal and the idea of invoke?
Okay. So I believe, so what happens is when we say a class is nothing but a blueprint. It's a very static entity, right? And it really emulates any kind of model or any kind of entity in the real world. So you can write a class for a car, right? But that is a blueprint. So this is, so when you write a class, you have variables and functions within that that particular class, but that class cannot operate by itself. And that is the reason why we end up writing a new statement where what we are trying to really do is instantiate that particular class. And when I say instantiate, all I'm trying to do is I allocate memory to that particular class, right? So it's actually, so class is the blueprint, or it's I would say a template, and the instance is how the class would really operate in real time with the memory allocated, and it could have different values stored within that particular class, or different methods written which really define the behavior. Okay, so that's exactly what a particular class is. I believe if you really want to understand the concept of a class and the instantiation of a class, you might want to go back and refer to some object-oriented basics, which will really help you understand beyond what I have explained as to how and why you write a class, and um, how to instantiate a particular class. But new is a keyword to instantiate a particular class, which does nothing but allocate memory to a particular class so that it can execute during runtime. Okay. Do we have another question, or
I don't see any more in the chat window.
okay, then I think that is pretty much it. But feel free to post your questions even on the blog or the YouTube channel, and we'll try to answer it to the best of our abilities. Thank you once again for joining in and being so patient. We ran over our time a little bit more, but hopefully it was all useful. And don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel, which is Part 2 Code. So thank you once again.
Thank you so much for the great content. And thank you everyone for joining.
Bye-bye.
Bye.